In this section, we'll look at some of the specific industries that really grew in the 1920s and made the economy boom. Certainly, the industry of construction and the industry of the automobile were leading the way. In the 1920s, both these industries saw considerable growth. All the urban growth demanded new construction, and so you see all these new skyscrapers. And there was a big real estate boom, especially in places like Florida. Down in Miami Beach, for example, there was a growth of something called Art Deco architecture, and with new building materials, you begin to see things like neon signs and shiny colors. And here you see circular wall corners and windows on the edges of buildings. Some of this Art Deco is you can still see in Miami Beach. The explosion of the automobile industry was probably the country's most important development economically. And better production line dramatically reduced the amount of time and cost it took to build a car. Before the assembly line, it took approximately 14 hours to build a car. After the assembly line, it only took approximately 93 minutes. In 1921, there were about 1.5 million cars sold. In 1929, there were over 5 million cars sold. In 1920, 9 million people traveled in cars. By 1929, 26.5 million people did. By the end of the decade, auto workers made up 7% of all wage earners in manufacturing. And combined with related industries, it accounted for 10% of all non-agricultural jobs. Leading the boom in the automobile industry was the Ford Motor Company's Model T. The Model T was mass produced. It was first produced in 1908 and continued in production until 1927. It had a standard amenities. They were all black, but they were cheap because they were mass produced, and they became cheap enough for a lot of people to buy them, not just the wealthy. Henry Ford himself became sort of a cultural hero, and he sort of represented to many people old-fashioned know-how. You know, he was sort of the myth of the common man, the tinker in his shop. Along with Carnegie and others, sort of the Horatio Alger story again. He was a likable guy. He lived simply, and he professed very conservative Christianity, very conservative values. He'd opposed World War I before the war, and I remember in the World War I lecture we talked about the peace ship he had launched. It was therefore somewhat ironic that the Ford championed conservative values when he made the car, because as we'll talk about later in culture, but the car did more to break down traditional values than anything else. By the end of the 1920s, Ford had serious competition from the General Motors Company. General Motors recognized that cars could be an example of status, and they began to market annual models with optional upgrades and fancy amenities that people would say, wow, look at them, they must be doing well. It was not just a vehicle to get from one place to another, it sort of defined yourself. And so General Motors took off with upscale cars and new models annually and really expanded the industry that way. The economic ripples from the cars was incredible. Cars would needed, paved roads, because whereas horses could pull through mud ditches, cars would get stuck, and so we had to pave all of the roads. This, of course, employed thousands in roads and sidewalks that spread all across the United States. Gas stations sprung up across the United States everywhere, and you could pull into a gas station, and we had a mechanic, which was sort of an auto mechanic, was a new industry, and they'd offer to check your oil and wipe your windshield and pump your gas for you. Suburbs, which had begun with the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, continued to sprawl out from the cities. You see a new construction boom in the 1920s with new styles. For example, a new style of the 1920s was the bungalow, and it came with new amenities like things they called a breakfast nook. The 1920s also saw the explosion of air travel. After the war, many pilots were let go from the military service, and they would buy their airplanes and they would travel around the United States, landing in fields outside small towns. And people had heard of airplanes, they may have even seen one, but they'd never been up in one. Well, we have 2 and 3 seaters now, and so pilots would take people up for a fee, and they'd want to give them a good show, and so they would fly down low near the barn, and they became known as barnstormers. And what this does is this sort of popularizes air travel. It doesn't seem as scary, or only daredevils do it. You do see in the 1920s things like wing walkers and stuff. It just made air travel much more common. In 1925, Congress passed legislation letting the post office carry mail by airplanes, and thus you have the first, airmail delivery. In 1926, the following year, Congress passes the Air Commerce Act, which permitted private commercial air service regulated and controlled by the Department of Commerce. And this was one of the few examples in the 1920s of the Republican-dominated government actually regulating, but here they had to. As a result, the first scheduled air service began in 1926. It was not major, it was just between certain cities. But by 1930, there were 122 airlines in operation. These included things like Trans World Airways and Eastern Airlines and United Airlines. A lot of businessmen were traveling, and to get customers, these airlines would often have young single women to serve them drinks, known as stewardesses. The next major advancement, by the way, was in 1936 when they came out with the Douglas DC-3. It was all metal, faster, and it carried more, and it soon became the workhorse of the commercial airline industry. All the new commercial airlines meant, of course, they had to have airports for each city, and so cities began to construct airports, which meant a lot of construction jobs. Moreover, when the airports were operating, you had ticket takers and mechanics for the airplanes and ground crew and luggage handlers, and so that was a real economic engine. I think one of the best examples of that would be after World War II when the Dallas-Fort Worth airport opened. It was a real economic engine for the Dallas Metroplex. This concludes the sections on the construction, automobile, and airline industries.